Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Man, you interrupted me while I was asleep. I was taking a nap, trying to catch my Z's. All right, man. So this is the last game I'm gonna do today, and I'm gonna leave you guys alone. I'm gonna stop bothering y'all. But anyway, I have the round 9 game from Wesley versus Vidit Gujrathi. And for all my people from the Philippines, you guys, probably a lot of you guys are getting up by now. It's 6:05 a.m. So I'm Sao Tayo, Magandang Umaga, Maayong Buntag. To my people that speak Cebuano, Higala and Kaibagan, Kamusta to you guys. Appreciate you guys stopping by very much. And for all of my people that are from northern or central India who speak Hindi, namaste to you guys. And Dhanyavad for coming by and taking a look at my video. Appreciate it very much. So the good thing about Hindi is I understand quite a nice chunk of it just because I speak Nepali pretty well. So I get, it's a lot of it, a majority of it is Sanskrit based. So it's just going to be kind of like different dialects of old Sanskrit, except for Tamil. Tamil is going to be a completely different language altogether. So anyway, appreciate you guys stopping by very much. If you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. All right, so we got D4, knight to F6. Bishop to F4. So we have, it starts off as an Indian. We get into a London situation, and it just stays in the London. So we have D5, E3, C5, knight comes to F3. We have E6, knight B to D2, and we have queen to B6. So we see a lot of queen moves in this tournament. We got queen A5s, queen B6s. Pretty much, it's pretty general for, when you have the bishop comes outside of the pawn chain and it deserts this pawn. Queen B6 is a very common way to, kind of combat that. When I play queen's pawns defenses as black, I get a lot of queen B3s. It's a little bit annoying sometimes. But anyway, so we see rook coming to B1, just protecting the pawn. So we have bishop to D6, and this is the novelty of the game. It's the first time this has been seen. It's a brand new move. It's kind of crazy because we're at move 6. So it's kind of interesting how this is like a novelty of the game. So we see bishop takes D6, queen takes D6, and we have knight to E5. So we have knight to C6, bishop comes to B5. We're looking pretty good. We got the piece pinned down on C6, but that is easily eliminated when you castle. So we see bishop takes C6, pawn takes C6, and we have knight to B3. So pawn takes D4, pawn takes D4, we have knight to E4. This is temporary placement. The knight is not going to live there forever. The knights that really have the biggest chance of planting themselves in the opponent's position are going to be whites. So we see F3, we see F6, knight comes to D3, knight comes to G5, we see queen to E2. And then we see bishop to A6. So this is temporarily unfortunate because it is pinning this knight to this queen right here. But that's easily solved with queen to E3. So we see H6, knight D to C5. And like I said before, black has a light squared bishop. So it's literally never going to be able to contest these knights on these dark squares. Well, this one on the dark square. So if this knight ever gets snapped off, it's easily replaced by the next knight. So you're looking really, really good as far as white is concerned. Getting into this black side of the board. So we see bishop to C8. We have F4, knocking that knight away. Pretty logical move. The knight doesn't really have anywhere to go now. And of course, you're not going to come and jump here because you're just going to be losing a pawn, and that's not very attractive. We're not going to do that. So we see knight to F7. And we see castles by white. We got rook to D8. Rook B to E1. We have rook to E8. And we have queen to D3. Now, pretty much up to this point, white is playing, very, very strong. He's doing, pretty much kind of steamrolling Gujrathi a little bit. He's basically, making it as challenging as possible for black to kind of find any legitimacy with his pieces. So we see queen coming to C7. We have rook to E2, knight to D6. We see C3, knight comes to C4, and we see queen to G3. It's not super significant, but we are putting this queen opposite this queen. It's always interesting, like when you do stuff like that. A lot of times you might have like a knight or something in the way, and if you can produce a certain situation, you can maybe give a discovery check to the king and win this queen. It happens a lot. I try to take advantage of it as much as possible in my own games. So we see a5, an attempt to try to like knock this knight away. Pretty much if the knight does get knocked away, you can just kind of redirect it. Ooh, let's get that right. You can kind of redirect it like this, and it's going to live on d3, so you're not too worried about a4 coming. We see rook f to e1. So as you can see, black in black's position, its major weakness is this backward pawn on e6, because as you can see, there are no pawns on either side helping to protect it, so it does need to be protected by pieces. So we see knight coming to d6, queen coming to g6. We have king to f8. Now, in the game, we saw g4, but I'm curious if anybody can find a move that pretty much puts black in a Zugzwang. And for those of you who don't know what Zugzwang is basically putting them in a position where you don't want to move, because if you do move, pretty much any move you make is going to worsen your position or not help it at all. So like I said, go ahead and pause it real quick and see if you can find the Zugzwang move for white here. All right, cool. So the move is queen to h7. Doesn't look like it does much, but like I said before, as you can see, you know, black doesn't really have a lot of good moves. You don't want to move this bishop because it's helping to protect this pawn, and is actually at the moment kind of under defended. So, you know, you have the possibility of snapping it off. You don't want to move the bishop, like I said, here. You don't want to move it here because that's just going to be takes with a fork. You know, you don't really want to move this rook for the same reason you don't want to move the bishop. It's going to be giving away this pawn, and stuff like this is going to hurt because you're going to be moving here with the queen. And there's just too much penetration going on. You know, the queen, so a lot of black's pieces are pretty much holding down the position that we see here. So you don't really want to move it. So after queen to h7, you might see something like a4 that gives away the pawn. But after queen comes to a7, it's interesting because you can actually give away the knight here. And then after you push g4, queen takes a4, we see g5. We're about to like bust the position open for white. Rook comes to b7. Knight comes to c5 with the fork. You see queen to a7, queen to h8 with check, king comes to e7. You see queen taking g7 with check, king to d8. Knight takes b7 with check, queen takes b7, queen takes f6 with check, queen to e7, and then queen takes h6. And as you can see, you've given up an entire piece, but you do have 7 pawns to 3 pawns. So you have 4 pawns for the piece. So you have well enough compensation for the piece. And you do have 2 completely passed pawns and then another passed pawn over here. That if you can start to get those rolling, usually they're going to have to give up an entire piece. So backing up, we did have g4, and you start to kind of see like some issues with these 2 movements. As you can see, these 2 pawns here are not very well defended, so that becomes relevant. And it makes things kind of hard for Wesley. So he has to really work to get a win. So we see a4, knight taking a4. We got knight to e4. Knight a goes to c5. Knight takes c5, knight takes c5. We see queen taking f4. And like I said, you know, pushing those 2 pawns, we kind of had a discover attack, and you know, we were able to snap off a pawn. And so we see a4. You know, it's the most logical move in the position because you do have the pass pawn. So you do want to try to get it rolling. We see e5, and e5 is significant because it's starting to open the game. And it's starting to activate this bishop. You don't have all the problems that you had before with all these different pieces being tied down to protecting something. So now you have a much more open position for black. So you see pawn takes e5, queen takes g4 with check, queen takes g4, bishop takes g4. And so black is gaining a lot of tempo, you know, on white. So we see rook to f2. The king comes down to f7. We see b4, you know, protecting that hanging pawn. We see h5. Giving this bishop a nice like little anchor, so it's not easily knocked away. So we see a5, d4 comes, pawn takes d4, rook takes b4. Now this is a pretty thematic move, d4, because you know this pawn is protecting this pawn. So the best thing to do is to undermine the pawn. So it seems like it gives a pawn away, but you're able to kind of redirect your forces and put some threats on black or white. So the rook comes to f4, protects the pawn on d4. We see rook to b2. We have rook to a1, rook to a8. You know, we have to protect that that pass pawn. So we push the pawn to a6. Rook comes to a7. We see pawn takes f6, pawn takes f6, and then we see rook a to f1. And then we have some pretty strong threats going on for white here. So we see f5, rook 1 to f2. We see rook to b5, king to g2, with a very clear intent of pushing this pawn to dislodge this this bishop. And of course, you know, we don't want to push here. I guess that wouldn't really make any sense at all anyway. I mean, you're going to be snapping off here, but it didn't even like prevent this move. So it doesn't make any sense. So forget what I said. So back up here. So we see king coming to g6, unpinning itself on the f file. We see h3, and then the bishop comes down to d1, but then that does drop the pawn on f5. So we see bishop to b3, knight comes to g3. We see bishop to d5, king to h4, rook to b4. We're threatening this pawn here, but that's not really in enough time. We see rook to g5 with check. The king comes to h7, rook takes h5 with check. King comes to g6. We see rook to g5, check again. King going back to h7. We see rook to h5, king to g6, rook to f4. And now we're, this is just a very, very nice position. And it's finished off pretty nicely here. So the bishop comes to c4. You know, just attacking that pawn on the a file, a6. We see rook to g5 with check. King comes to h7. Rook to h5, king to g6, rook to g4 with check. King to f6. Rook to h6, rook to f5, rook to h5. We're just doing a little bit of repeating. So I'm thinking that they were in like some time situation. So they're trying to gain a little bit of time on the clock. At least Wesley So is. We see king to f6, rook back to h6, and we see king to f5. And we're at the point in the game where I want you to go ahead and stop the video. And there is a mate in 2 in the position. And I want you to see if you can find it. Go ahead and stop it and try to find the mate in 2 real quick. All right, cool. So the magical move is creating a checkmate net with the knight, and it is knight to e4. Knight to e4 threatens 3 different checkmates. There's a checkmate coming here. There's a checkmate coming here, and there's also a checkmate coming here. You cannot defend against all 3. So, like I said, I mean, there's just nothing to do. I mean, if you protect against this one, there's that is checkmate. That is checkmate. There's all kinds of checkmates. So the king is in a complete mating net. You know, you can't do that to protect down here. You're going to still be getting mated or getting mated this way. So, yeah, when you're getting threatened by 3 different checkmates at once, usually it's impossible to defend against all 3 of them. So it gets pretty sad. So after knight to e4, that was the position that Vidit Gujrathi does resign the game. Wesley So, you know, had a really good day after having a really bad day yesterday. So he was able to kind of claw his way back into the standings. I will make the next video for round 10 in the morning, which would be pretty late, probably be about 8-9 p.m. to, you know, my people in the Philippines. So like I said, for everybody that came by and took a look at my video, maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. And dhanyavad, as they say in Nepali, sati or sati haru. You know, my friends, appreciate you guys very much for coming by. And I will see you guys next time.